Hi, Hans.
Hey, Colin. I see it's being live streamed, so you're all set.
Okay, great. I just made you co-host as well.
Okay.
Okay, we'll just wait for people to come in.
At least we have.
Welcome in, Holly.
Hi, how are you, Colin?
I'm well, thank you. We should
Good.
have Commissioner Hall joining in just a couple minutes here.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for getting us started. And just to be sure, do you have the updated presentation that I sent to you yesterday, just with a few updates to slide 11? If not, that's okay. Colin, can you hear me all right?
Yes, thank you. 1 second.
Okay, sure.
Okay, Holly, I'm not seeing the updated slides.
Sure, let me send them to you again. If we
Thanks.
need to use the slides that you had previously, that's okay. There's just a few minor changes to dates on slide 11 that I want to make everyone aware of. But let me see if I can find that really quick.
Good morning, Holly. This is Phil. Can you hear me okay?
Hi, Phil. Yeah, I can hear you just fine. Thank you.
All right.
All right, Colin, I just sent that updated slide deck again. You should have that any moment. But again, if we need to get started with the previous slide deck, that will be just fine.
Okay, thank you, Holly.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Joe Maestas, Vice Chair here with New Mexico PRC. How are you all?
Good morning, Vice Chair.
Good. Good morning.
Very good.
Great to see you.
Great to see you. Beautiful day in New Mexico.
It's a little overcast. It's unseasonably cool. We've been in the middle of a extended monsoon season, which was badly needed. You know, our state was literally on fire. And so this is just well-received relief in the form of these monsoons.
Very good. Very good. Is all under control now, or
Yes, I
at
think
least headed in the right direction?
Yeah, the biggest fire in the state's history, almost 400,000 acres. It's about 96% contained. But now we're facing flooding. You know, once the soil is denuded, then, you know, you get the rains, and we just had 3 people pass away in flash floods, you know, near the burn scar area. So we're kind of on pins and needles and trying to raise the awareness on the part of people in that area that, you know, don't take chances, don't cross these low water crossings and think you're going to get past it. So anyway, we're on the mend, and the feds have stepped in and promised the 100% federal aid because it was started by a control burn. So the aid is starting to flow because a lot of people have been displaced, lost everything. So I gave you, I
it's
told
been
a
ongoing.
little more than you wanted to know.
No. Well, I'm happy that things are going in the right direction. This has been going on for a long time, and I know the impacts are hard when people are waiting for assistance. Yeah.
Californians know all about the wildfire landslide cycle.
I was just going to say your story sounds very familiar.
Mm.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good
Morning,
morning.
Madam Chair.
Hi, nice to see you again. And hi, Mr. Penningill.
Yeah, hello. Good to see you as well.
It's so nice to see you, Chairwoman Hall.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here, and it's nice to be welcoming you guys. I'm really excited about your presentation. So I think we should get started. It doesn't look like we have a lot of people on the Zoom, but that's fine. I'm sure people will be listening in on YouTube. So we'll get started. My name is Cynthia Hall. I'm chair of the Public Regulation Commission. Today is Thursday, August 4th, 10 o'clock and 10:02 in the morning. And we're here to conduct a special meeting to hear a presentation by Holly Taylor on the extended day-ahead market of the California Independent System Operator. So, Ms. Taylor, would you like to put up your slides?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I'd just like to remind the commission that there was a noticed agenda similar to the regular meeting. So I would, as short as it is, I would recommend following the posted agenda. So we'll have the call to order and roll call, the pledge, and then the approval of the agenda. Then Ms.
Of
Taylor
course.
can present her slides.
Can you put that up, please, Hans, so everybody can see that?
I sure
agenda?
will.
Madam Chair, I can take the roll when you're ready.
Thank you. Great. All right. So, I'm calling this meeting to order. I'll do it again. It's Thursday, August 4th, 10:04 in the morning. And this is the New Mexico Public Regulation special meeting on the CAISO extended day-ahead market. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Could we have a roll call, please?
Yes, Madam Chair. Commissioner Fishman. Commissioner Vicente Aguilar. Commissioner Maestas.
I'm here.
Madam Chair.
I'm here.
And Commissioner Byrd.
My present.
Madam Chair, we have 3 commissioners present. That is a quorum. So the commission may continue with the meeting.
Okay, great. Let's have a Pledge of Allegiance. Mr. Byrd, would you like to lead us?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I salute the flag of the state of New Mexico and the Zia symbol of perfect friendship among united cultures. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Byrd. All right, we have consideration and approval of the agenda.
Madam Chair, move to approve the agenda as presented.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. I have a motion and a second. Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Madam Chair, you may want to just call as a procedural matter, call for any discussion.
Oh, is there any discussion of the agenda?
It's a
Hearing
wonderfully
none.
short agenda.
Thank you.
Okay, Madam Chair, I will take the roll. Commissioner Byrd,
Aye.
Commissioner Vicente Aguilar, Commissioner Fishman, Commissioner Maestas,
Aye.
and Madam Chair.
Aye.
Madam Chair, the agenda is approved, 3 votes in favor and 2 commissioners absent.
Okay, thank you. So now we'll go to item 4. This is the item where we talk about the presentation. And the presentation is going to be made today by Ms. Holly Taylor, and I believe assisted by Phil Pettingill, sorry. And it's going to be about the extended Dayahead market as proposed by CAISO, the California Independent System Operator. So with that, Ms. Taylor, would you like to begin your presentation?
Yes, thank you, Chairwoman. I appreciate the time. Commissioners, thank you for joining us today for this presentation. My name is Holly Taylor. I am the Manager of Regional Affairs for the California Independent System Operator. Also joining me today is Phil Pettingill. Phil is the Director of Regional Integration, and also on the line with us today is Milos Vasanik. Milos is the Regional Market Sector Manager for Market Infrastructure Policy at the ISO. So we have Phil and Milos joining us. They have been working through the course of this year to bring stakeholders from across the West together to develop a straw proposal for this extended day-ahead market, really engaging stakeholders from all sectors in the development of this proposal, and now have been working since its release in April to fine-tune this proposal, really develop it further in further stakeholder technical working groups. So we have Phil and Milos with us today. They're going to walk us through an overview of the straw proposal, and then we'll talk about milestones and continued opportunities for engagement on the development of this market design. And then we'll talk about a parallel initiative to this, parallel to the market design, which is EDAM governance. So not a lot of time on EDAM governance, but we will cover that and talk about opportunities for engagement there. So again, thank you for your time. We really appreciate the opportunity to present this information to the Commission. And I will turn things over to Phil and Milos.
Great. Thank you, Holly. And good morning, Madam Chair and Commissioners. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today about our new project, the Extended Day-Ahead Market. And so what I'm going to do is go through basically 2 parts in the front portion of our presentation. A little bit of an overview, context setting, and what's happening with the EDAM. But then also we'll drive down into a couple of details, talk a little bit more specifics, and certainly interested in entertaining any questions you have as I go along. I'll move along at a pretty good pace, but if you have a question, please feel free to interrupt, and we can answer those questions as we go. I'll go through the slides, but Milos, being the lead for our policy development, is joining us. So if we do have any other questions that you might have, we certainly can engage Milos as well as we go. So let's go to the next slide, please. So to begin with, the concept behind the day-ahead market is to take what we've already learned with the Western Energy Imbalance Market, the EIM, and look at extending that out into the day-ahead market. You may be aware that with the Western EIM, only a fraction of the total energy is actually cleared in that market, something less than 5% of the energy. And so looking at the day ahead creates an opportunity to have a larger portion of the energy market for the 24 hours of operation to optimize that and look at gaining some economic as well as some other benefits. And so wanted to start with this slide here just to orient you in terms of the 3 buckets of benefits that we see in the topics that we're discussing in the policy design. The first piece being the economic, that looking at a day-ahead market, it gives the system operator an opportunity to look at more units across a larger footprint and a larger time frame, given the 24 hours of tomorrow's operations. So that expansion of the capacity and then the characteristics of the fleet create an opportunity to optimize that unit commitment in the day ahead and really generate some significant economic benefits. But those things also then translate into reliability benefits because having that larger footprint and a more diverse fleet of resources creates ability to have the operation coordinated across the bigger system as well. But one of the things that also happens is the ability to transfer energy from one balancing area to another. You may know that in the Western interconnection, there's almost 40 balancing areas, each of them going through the processes that we're going to talk about today in very different ways, but also doing it on their own. And so to the extent there's an opportunity to buy and sell energy between each other, they do that sometimes in a much forward context. But here we get an opportunity to do that in the day ahead and see what we can do to improve the reliability and the economics of the overall system. There is a third piece, which is the environmental aspect. And certainly many of the states in the West, including yourselves, are looking at how to reduce emissions, how to get to a clean electric grid. And currently one state, California, has a greenhouse gas pricing mechanism. And so the market needs to price in that cost of carbon. To the extent the states develop those carbon prices, we want to make sure we have a market design that's actually flexible enough and scalable enough to incorporate those multiple states as we go. And you may or may not be aware that Washington is literally just a couple years away from having their carbon pricing mechanism in place. So the market discussion has been talking about how to incorporate not just one state, but at least 2 by the time we're about 2 or 3 years from now. So that's the overall picture in terms of why the 3 buckets of benefits we see. Let's move to the next slide and talk a little bit about what does it mean to participate in the extended day-ahead market. Well, as I mentioned, we've got a fair amount of experience with the Western EIM, over 85% of the load in the Western interconnection, and I think we're up to about 14 entities now are participating in that EIM. The EIM, of course, is just the real-time market. But the EDAM still, we envision that it'll have the same kind of division of responsibilities in the sense that those balancing areas will still maintain their reliability obligations and responsibilities. Those, of course, come from FERC reliability standards or NERC, but the reality of it is they would still have all of those reliability functions. In addition, the transmission function, the long-term transmission planning and the resource planning that the utilities are working through with you in terms of where to take your portion of the system, but all those still remain with the balancing area in their portion of the service territory. But ultimately, participation in the EDAM, though, provides that opportunity then to take that resources and that transmission grid and optimize it to match their unique load and responsibilities on their portion of the system. So that's really what happens in participating in the EDAM. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through some more of the material here today. Let's move to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the day-ahead market is run in the day ahead. It actually closed. We are taking bids and inputs until 10 a.m. We run that market and publish those results at 1 p.m. for the following day. And the market then is determining what is a set of resources, the transfers, and a number of other elements for each of the 24 hours in the following operations. But in order to do that, there's a fair amount of work that needs to be done ahead of that market process. And so today we're going to talk about two elements of that in the pre-day ahead box that I have here. What's really important is that as the EDAM entities come into the marketplace, that they actually can show they have enough resources to serve their load. And so we're designing a resource sufficiency evaluation with the stakeholders that would give them an opportunity to reflect the resources that they have and match that ability for those resources to produce energy, but match it to what their load profile is in the next 24 hours. So that's what the resource sufficiency evaluation is. And we'll spend a little bit more time on that in a couple more slides. But the other piece of this is bringing transmission to the table. Transmission assets are already built, they're out there, they're available. And what the market creates an opportunity to do is optimize the utilization of that transmission. So the idea is how to bring the transmission capacity into the market and allow the market to then identify the most efficient places to generate the energy, how to transmit it, and then how to get it to the various loads across the system. So the pre-day ahead process creates an opportunity for the participants to show us they have the resources and to make that transmission available to the market to operate. Now, once we move into the market in this time frame I was talking about, the 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., there's a few processes here, and I'll just touch on a couple of them. The most important is this first one. The IFM stands for Integrated Forward Market, and the RUC is the Residual Unit Commitment. What's important to understand about these two is the IFM is the purely financial market. And so bids and quantities of energy are provided, and that market will find that place where the supply matches the demand and what the clearing price and quantities are. Of course, since that's purely economic, it certainly is possible that that market can clear at something at or below what, as the system operator, we think will be needed to meet the reliability needs on the grid. In other words, we're going to do our own load forecast. And if the financial market clears below that forecast, it's going to be important for us to identify additional resources that we could put online just in case that forecast becomes true. And that's what the residual unit commitment does. It gives us an opportunity in the day ahead process to identify some incremental capacity that we can put online or otherwise know is available to us and use that in the following day if we need to service all the load. There is, of course, a market power mitigation step. That step happens, frankly, before we start the IFM to make sure that any market power is mitigated. And so we will have that in the day ahead process. We're not envisioning convergence.
Excuse me a minute. Pardon me for interrupting.
Yeah, sure.
Can I just ask you to go a little deeper into the residual unit commitment aspect just a little bit? It sounds like it's kind of a backup or fail-safe kind of function. Have I got that right or not?
Well, all of the ISOs and RTOs have this sort of two-step process. So thank you, Chairwoman, for asking a little bit more detail. Happy to spend some time on this. As I was saying, the IFM being purely financial creates almost an incentive for certainly load serving entities to have that market clear at or below what may occur in the following day, as I mentioned. So what the RUC does is it runs sequentially, all within that same time frame that I was talking about. So it's important to think about these two pieces as the total day ahead market run. They really are not separate. I'm describing them separate, but what's happening with the market engine and the software that's running is identifying what that IFM is, compare it to what the system operator load forecast is, and then identifying if there's any additional capacity to put online. Let me describe what I mean by put it online. If we had, let's say, a 400 megawatt gas-fired generator, and we needed potentially an additional 300 megawatts of capacity for tomorrow's operations, what's important is for us to identify, does that generator need to be put online now? And if so, it may have 100 megawatts worth of minimum operating level. So the market needs to know that so that we're not dispatching more capacity than is needed to clear this total day ahead process. So in a way, it's not really a backup or a fail-safe. It's an integration with that financial market to make sure that what comes out at 1 p.m. is a total set of resources that are necessary to serve the load. But also, in the case of the California Balancing Authority, we also identify any contingency reserves or other capacity that's needed for meeting our reliability needs. Okay, so it's an integrated process. Is I think the way to think about those two. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's very helpful. I appreciate it.
Okay, good. So external resource participation is the concept where we may have entities joining the EDAM and participating in EDAM with their resources, but certainly there are other entities that may not be joining the EDAM. And as a result, we want to at least identify the rules and the procedures on how they still can participate or sell that energy into the market if they choose to, even though they're not signing up for the EDAM in total. And then finally, I've already touched a little bit on the GHG accounting, but the concept here, of course, is to make sure that the market is considering if there is a GHG price that needs to be considered, that price is incorporated in the dispatch, and those generators that are in particularly providing the energy that have a GHG obligation would be compensated for those GHG costs. So all of those elements are contained in what I'm referring to as the actual day ahead process. And then, of course, out of that is the results. And the results then get posted after that 1 o'clock time frame. And there's a few key things to touch on here. One, of course, is to the extent that there was any transfer revenues, any value to the transmission that we're using, that amount of revenue would be identified. And we could, in fact, actually do settlement on this whole day ahead market. Because the way the ISO runs today, as we've talked about earlier with the EIM, we're already doing settlements for the real time. So we could also do settlements on the day ahead. We generally put those two statements together and send out a single settlement statement, but think about it as really two different markets that are settling in complete total transactions. And then finally, the last piece on after we run this market is the confidence in transfers. Because balancing areas now will be potentially transferring energy out to other balancing areas, or importing energy from a balancing area either adjacent to them or 2 or 3 balancing areas away. It's important for us to have a process and a market solution that creates the confidence that those transfers will flow during the operational period. So these 3 areas of time give you a sense of what's going to happen once the EDAM is running, but also a pretty good idea of the policy topics that we're discussing with stakeholders. Let's go to this last slide.
Can I ask you one more question, Phil?
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
So greenhouse gas accounting is something that our state is, well, I'm interested in, I should say. And I know there's been workshops conducted this summer about it. Is that, but my understanding was it's of interest not just to states that are actually planning greenhouse gas, emissions specifically, but I thought it also had bearing on states with renewable portfolio standards, and that, New Mexico, I believe, would be a state that would be interested in those kinds of transactions. So could you talk a little bit about how greenhouse gas emissions would be dealt with in the day-ahead market?
Sure, thank you, Joan. It is a good question. And what we can do is parse it a little bit more here. I am going to touch on it a little bit more later on, but let me just answer your question this way for now. And then if there's more, we can certainly cover that in a couple of slides from now.
Okay.
I mentioned the GHG pricing as part of what's happening in our policy design and the actual running of the market itself. That supply and demand bids matching against the resources and the imports and exports of the system, and doing that in an economic way to meet reliability. If carbon has been priced like we have today in the state of California, then we're going to want to incorporate that carbon price. Now, that doesn't mean, and similar again to California, as you asked as well, other states have RPS goals or other clean energy policies in place. And one of the things that the ISO does, for example, in California, is we will report what the generators have been operating at least within our market. So, and we'll do that to the regional accounting system, Regis. So I'm sure, as you're aware, that, you know, WEC manages this system that keeps track of the renewable energy credits for all of the renewable resources that are operating, you know, in the Western interconnection. And so the ISO, as a reporting entity, will identify, you know, the hours and the megawatts that those resources have operated. So the entities in the respective states where those RPS goals exist can then have, you know, confidence that it's not only the generator reporting to WEC, but there's a second entity, the ISO, being able to report and validate what those resources have been doing to have those renewable energy credits and qualify those towards the RPS program. So there is more that is done, certainly, in trying to support the state policies for clean energy. But I was just referring to the more market and the pricing aspect when I started off. But thank you for asking that clarifying question. Does that start to help?
Oh, yeah, that's very helpful. I hadn't heard that explanation before, and it's very good. Thank you.
All right, good.
Yeah.
Well, let me wrap up this opening portion here just by saying, hitting a couple of these key features. First of all, joining the EDAM is voluntary. We're expecting that the entities that are already in the Western EIM, they would be the ones that want to expand the value proposition from just the real time into the day ahead market. And we are designing it so not only is it fairly easy to enter, partly because EIM entities have already done most of the work that's necessary to interface and engage with the ISO, but also easy to exit. At this point, we're talking about a 6-month notice period that would allow us to then modify the systems, close out the settlements, and so forth and so on, to make it easy to come in and then also make it easy to exit as well. We've touched on the fact that the EDAM entities will still retain their responsibilities for planning, not only the resources, but the transmission, and also those responsibilities for reliability as well. And so the couple of key things we've also touched on is the day ahead resource efficiency evaluation. And I'm going to drill down some more on that in a second. Maximizing that transmission availability really creates an opportunity to fully utilize the infrastructure that's on the system, but also creates an opportunity to transfer energy at different times of the day, optimized across a much broader set of characteristics in the fleet. And then finally, once we do that, we need to make sure that folks are confident in those transfers as they are today with their bilateral transactions, but these would now be happening on a daily basis as part of the EDAM. So let me stop here before we start to drill down and just say any questions in terms of this sort of high level characterization, because then I wanted to spend a little more detail with you on the resource efficiency, transmission, and also GHG.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Vice Chair Maestas.
Yeah, I read the kind of the straw proposal, the written part, and I got a little nervous when I came across the maximizing transmission availability. You know, has that been an issue? Because, you know, we have some grid issues here in New Mexico. The pace in which it takes to expand it, given public lands and tribal lands, has made, you know, building new transmission from planning all the way to completion quite a process that takes place over many, many years. And so how much of an issue is that? And then how do you assess transmission availability?
Yeah, I mean, what we will do is be looking at the existing transmission. Certainly, if we were talking about the context of a full RTO, Commissioner, then we may be also discussing long-term transmission planning and how the RTO can help identify transmission, support the need for it, and so forth. The EDAM is not intended to do that at this point. We're doing things as we usually do in the West, which is, you know, building things incrementally. So this day ahead market is really built on top of the existing transmission that you have. And certainly we understand and appreciate the challenges of getting new transmission built and added to the system, today. So I am certainly hearing and understanding where you're coming from. I think it's just fair to recognize what we are trying to do is unlock the transmission capacity that you have and try to maximize that utilization. As you add more, then ideally that transmission comes into this market and you get the opportunity to see those transfers and the utilization of that transmission as it goes forward as a new asset. And similarly, that's true with the resources as well. As I mentioned, the resource sufficiency evaluation is important to recognize that any entity joining the EDAM can show that they have enough resources to serve their load. But once they've done that, we're going to look at opportunities to optimize this fleet and again, try to unlock some efficiencies from a cost standpoint by having more resources that can operate at different times of the day or maybe operate more efficiently at certain times of the day. So is that helpful in terms of where you're going with your question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Phil?
Yes, sir.
This is Commissioner Fishman. And for those folks who are part of EDAM, you see a lot of information about how we can better utilize and optimize the function of current transmission. Mm-hmm. Through various technology improvements and management protocols. Does the Dayahead market at all get it all involved in those discussions about how to better optimize or where we can improve the existing system incrementally?
Well, I tell you what the day ahead market and any of these wholesale energy markets can do is provide some more of that evidence, that information, that data, if you will. I like to think that as an ISO, what we're able to do is be the purveyor of information. So Commissioner Fishman, I think, one of the challenges you have in identifying, new transmission paths is, where's the most efficient place to build the transmission, let alone how to route it and permit it and construct it. But one of the things these markets can do is we have a principle that we refer to as congestion. And when you start to see that prices are rising because the transmission lines are not able to carry the most efficient energy, that can be a real strong driving force to actually add transmission to the grid. And let me just take a minute on that point, just so we're clear on why that could be a good justification for transmission. Think about that. If we had a large transmission line, that 3-lane highway from one set of generators to one set of load, and all 3 lanes are full, then that generation, that low cost generation can't get to that load. So our only choice is to have to go to maybe a more expensive generator to provide the energy to that load. That creates congestion cost. And if we can start to track that and identify how significant that is, that may very well then justify and support the need to add that 4th lane to the highway, if you will. I've been at the California ISO for 25 years, and I can assure you that there have been a couple of transmission lines, but one of them was reinforcing our 500 kV network from Northern to Southern California because of this very high level of congestion that I'm referring to. So just using that as an example, you may find that having the information that the market is producing can be really helpful in trying to justify transmission.
Okay. And that wouldn't be just new lines. It might also be upgrading current lines so we get the max out of them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
As I say, congestion is a nature of only having that 3-lane highway. If somehow or another we could get the traffic to flow a little faster on the 3 lanes, then let's do that. That's going to be certainly easier, less expensive, and still provide the necessary value to that. So that's where the congestion shows us that there's the constraint, and then we get an opportunity to go through the engineering process to see what's the most efficient way to relieve the constraint.
So I know it hasn't been there, the market hasn't been there that long, at least in terms of transmission development years, but are there any examples that you can point to where folks being a part of EDAM has created more and more clarity and more proactive action in terms of getting new transmission capacity in place?
First of all, EDAM is not up and running at this point.
Okay.
When we get to the end of our presentation, Holly's going to go through a few slides to show you a little bit about how we're going to finish up the stakeholder process, get to a policy proposal that'll modify the ISO's existing tariff, look for FERC approval on that, and then we would be able to launch the EDAM.
Okay.
I can answer your question in the context of course, California, because the day ahead and real-time markets have been running in California now for 25 years.
Okay.
So that's the reason why I was able to share with you that one example of the congestion case where we were able to do upgrades. There certainly is many cases where as the ISO staff is doing transmission planning on that portion of the grid that's under the RTO, then we're constantly identifying transmission projects and bringing that to the ISO board for approval and get the projects built. So that is a process that we're very experienced with. It's just not one that's at this point in the EDAM. It's because it's the EDAM, as I mentioned before, is only a portion of all the services you would expect from a full RTO.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Chairwoman, should we move along?
Yes, I just wanted to mention for Commissioner Fishman and others' benefit that CAISO had been conducting workshops over the past summer on different aspects of the EDAM and how it would be formed, and in connection with New Mexico's involvement in that MOU group, the 6 Western states with renewable energy mandates of one sort or another, either greenhouse gas emission mandates or renewable portfolio standard mandates. We had hired the services of one individual to participate in some of those workshops. So when you were mentioning, Commissioner Fishman, about being involved in the conversations, I think the conversations our representative was interested in or involved in didn't have to do with transmission so much as greenhouse gas accounting. But nevertheless, we, for our limited purpose, we did have some representation in some of the conversations, and going forward, we could glean what we can from what was done to see if there was any connection there. So I just wanted to put that out there. We haven't been completely uninvolved.
Yeah. But one thing I saw yesterday, and Phil, probably you're connected to this all the time, is the Maury Galbraith. I keep forgetting the name of his organization that he.
Western Energy Imbalance Market. Oh, Western Electricity. Never mind.
Coordinating Council. Is that it?
Yeah.
Western Interstate Energy Board. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Anyway, so the states that in response to the new FERC order, which I think is a great thing that they're looking at what they're looking at, Maury couldn't get any of the states to agree on, couldn't find any areas of agreement in terms of commenting on the FERC proposal in terms of interconnection. And so it feels like there's still, this, there's a lot of different interests that are not yet able to find common ground, at least amongst the states. And I guess for me, and Phil, this is probably a good thing for you, is that getting involved in something like EDAM starts to help folks find more areas of collaboration and common interest.
Yeah.
Because I was very disappointed to see that they couldn't make one single consensus comment on that FERC rule. And what can I say? That's kind of discouraging.
Yeah.
Anyway, I got off on a tangent there. Sorry.
Okay, it's very interesting. So yeah, let's go ahead, Phil, with the next.
Okay,
or
next
and
slide.
Holly. Yeah.
Okay, so as I said, we're going to go through a couple of slides here, just the next level down, if you will. So first of all, resource sufficiency. This is a place where the EDAM entities will bring their supply to the market. And what we're doing is working with them to design a tool that they would be able to input their proposed resources and their load profile and make advisory runs. So they can actually check that they would have enough resources to sufficiently pass that same test that when the ISO runs it just prior to operating the market. The discussion has been very, very constructive, very helpful. I think we've made a lot of progress during the course of the year with the stakeholders in regards to how to go about doing this test. What are the inputs that they can provide, their ability to access it. Of course, the ISO is still going to have to build it, but at least the design of it from a policy standpoint has been really constructive. And it'll give them that opportunity to make it multiple advisory runs prior to that 10 a.m. where the market actually closes. The other piece of this, though, is the question always is, what if there's an entity that fails to pass the test? What do we do in regards to consequences? And that's where more recently we spent most of our conversation in the stakeholder process. You can imagine that in certain circumstances, if a single entity is just a little short in passing the test, but there's clearly sufficient capacity on the rest of the EDAM footprint, then maybe that consequence for failure is more purely financial, just a financial penalty for not providing enough, but there is enough to actually operate this system. On the other hand, we go to the other end of the spectrum where things are overly tight. It is a deficiency that's difficult or across the overall footprint. And talking about what to do there and how to encourage as much capacity as possible being brought into the market so the market can, of course, generate that reliability-based solution and that confidence and transfers. So we're still not done with that. There's still more discussion to go. And one of the things, again, that Holly will mention is we're going to be putting out a new straw proposal that will have more detail and specifics on this based on the conversation that we've had with stakeholders. But I wanted to just drill down to this level of detail so you had a sense that the resource sufficiency evaluation is a critical building block for the market, but we also need to make sure that folks are coming in sufficiently supplied and building consequences if they're unable to do so. Any questions on that? Because next I'm going to move to transmission. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the transmission. The transmission
Phil,
is, yeah.
Well, another question occurs to me. So you're getting into a bigger market with the Dayahead than the bilateral.
Mm-hmm.
Is there ever an instance where being part of that bigger market has made less resources available to a participating entity?
No, I don't think so. Again, we've had some discussion here about what we're doing in this pure Dayahead, the EDAM, compared to RTOs. And I think the way I would answer your question this way is, in this construct, the balancing areas still are those individual entities that are going to have to be able to meet the FERC and NERC reliability standards. So that means they're supposed to be planning for enough resources plus contingency reserves, ancillary services, the other set of obligations they have to meet the operating standards individually. What we're doing is create an opportunity to help optimize that fleet of resources, but they're still required to do that individually as balancing areas. The place where you might see some reduction in capacity is in actually a full-blown RTO, because at that point, the different systems get merged together into a single balancing area. And so you can imagine where we have some portions of the system that are peaking at different hours or even different seasons of the year, you can actually now start to see some capacity savings as being part of an RTO because of that, overlay on which portions of the system are peaking at different times and hours of the day.
So you haven't, so you don't envision any instances where in making resources available to this day-ahead market, somebody might end up with less resources available the next day than they would have had under a existing bilateral arrangement.
Yeah. I don't know. Let me turn to Milos. This is a great question for Milos in terms of the details of what we've been thinking about and talking about with stakeholders. Milos, have you heard anything along this line based on Commissioner Fishman's question? Milos, you're on mute. Try again, Milos.
He's on a hard mute there.
Yeah.
Maybe on YouTube. Well, no, of course he wouldn't be.
All right.
Well, we'll get to as soon as he gets his sound.
Yeah, we'll see if we get his sound to come back. But I think you get the concept that the balancing areas are still retaining their footprint as you're used to and familiar with. And as a result, they would likely still need to have those comparable levels of capacity. Now, that of course changes over the long term, right? As you start doing the long-term resource planning and procurement, start to change out, some resources for other resources. I'm thinking about it more in the short term in terms of, days, weeks, or months, in terms of the capacity they have today. Okay, so let's go to the next slide on transmission. And what I wanted to talk a little bit about with you here on transmission is that our goal here is to maximize the transmission that's being made available to the EDAM to the extent it's high quality, it's firm, and it can actually provide these reliability benefits we're talking about. One way to think about this sort of first area of discussion that we've been having is when the EDAM entities are providing that information on their resource sufficiency evaluation, we are expecting them to also identify the transmission that might be necessary to get resources to their load. And in particular, if that was transmission that was coming from an adjacent balancing area to get to their load, what is the transmission that they've procured and is firm and is going to be there and service that load and the transfer of that energy. So that first area is the firm transmission that's already been bought, sold, committed in terms of the service of load. But of course, sometimes transmission is sold to other customers. And so we're also then having a discussion around for that transmission capacity that has certain rights or privileges because customers have procured those transmission rights. We want to encourage them to make their transmission available to the EDAM market as well. We can certainly imagine, transmission customer may have procured a couple hundred megawatts of transmission capacity, but may not necessarily be using that 200 megawatts every hour of every day. The market could certainly utilize that and provide a revenue stream back to those customers that otherwise had paid for it, but again, gives them an incentive to make the transmission capacity available for the market. So our discussion there is how to encourage even those customers who have capacity to bring it into the marketplace. And then finally, that transmission owner, that transmission provider that may have sold it to those customers, do they still have any unsold transmissions? Because certainly, while they're trying to sell the capacity that they have and they've bought and are paying for, it may not always be sold again every hour of every day. So now we want to actually go back to those transmission owners and encourage them to bring in any of the unsold transmission capacity to the EDAM. And so the discussion is centered around how will they get compensated? And in some cases, or initially we started thinking, well, maybe we need to have a price built into the market for the transmission. But very quickly, the stakeholders shared with us that they didn't feel like that was the most efficient way to dispatch an electric grid because it will create hurdles and it'll create potentially pancaking prices from one portion of the grid to the other. So at this point now, the discussion has really started to, again, gain some good momentum towards a principle of how do we just ensure that the transmission costs that the transmission owners have is getting revenue recovery. And that may be a charge that occurs after the market runs, because then we actually have the optimized dispatch and we have the net amount of transmission consumption that needs to be priced and paid for. So we're still working out the details of that, but to give you a sense of this, the discussion around transmission is comprehensive. It's not only what's there to serve load, but it's also there for transmission customers or even unsold or unused transmission to try to utilize that as best as possible. And so that's really I want to share with you in terms of drilling down a little deeper on the transmission. And let me stop here and just see any more questions around the transmission topic.
I guess I have a question. Well, and maybe there's not an answer yet because I guess you're still working on it, but it seems, I mean, you know, my first thought is, well, a transmission customer, you know, could be making individual deals with individual other participants who don't participate all the time. But honestly, it sounds like optimization after the fact of the trades would be, I mean, the fact that after transactions would be maybe the most realistic look at what the price should be for that transmission. How does this differ from what's done in RTOs?
Yeah, again, in the RTO, it's similar. Let me draw a parallel to the conversation I was having with Commissioner Fishman. In the RTO, as we talked about earlier, the actual balancing areas are eliminated or consolidated into a single BA, and the RTO becomes the system operator meeting all those FERC and NERC reliability standards. Okay, in the context under the EDAM, the different BAs still retain those obligations. Now, similarly in transmission, what happens then is transmission owners turn over the operational control of their transmission assets. And so the ISO now has access to all of the capacity, all of the time. Now, if somehow or another there was a long-term contract already in place, then, and this is what happened with us in California, we're very experienced in understanding what are the terms and conditions of that contract and making sure those terms and contractual arrangements still are protected underneath the ISO's operations. So those transmission customers would still have the ability to utilize that transmission, but they can also then release it to the market if they choose to do so and allow the ISO to actually use that transmission capacity in the marketplace. So, Chairwoman, you see what happens is under the RTO, the transmission owners turn over completely the operational control of that transmission. And in the case of the EDAM, they're not really doing that. They're just letting us know what capacity is available. And what we want to do is create opportunities and incentives for them to, should we say, approach what happens under an RTO to try to get the most transmission available as we can.
Right. I understand that. I did know that about RTOs. Everybody has to sort of relinquish control of their transmission, but I don't know that they're relinquishing control of the pricing. It was a pricing picture. I didn't really have a clear idea of RTOs, but I'm not sure it has to be relevant. I mean, what we're trying to deal with here is how to make this market work.
Yeah. And I'll just as an anecdote, I'll just say, so within the ISO RTO footprint, we do have, large transmission providers like PG&E or Southern Cal Edison, San Diego. Those entities, of course, are still going to FERC to get their transmission cost a revenue requirement approved. And then they bring that to the ISO. And that's how the ISO then determines what is the transmission access charge that we have under the RTO. Now, again, that charge is not applied in part of the market runs. It's not incorporated as a hurdle rate. What we do then is keep track of what were the energy transfers that occurred as a result of the market runs, and then collect those revenues after the fact from either the loads or resources, and then pass that money back to the transmission owner and provider. So in a way, we're doing something, should we say, comparable. The conversation has come around to something like that in the EDAM because of the downside of having hurdles in the market optimization creates that pancaking effect. And it's better to just do it after the fact with a calculation. So we're ending up coming back almost to where the RTO model, at least within CAISO, has been running for many, many years.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Let's move on to the nenext topic then. And we'll spend a little bit more on the GHG.
Phil?
Yes, Holly.
Just real quickly, I think Milos might be available. His audio might be working now.
Do we get to go, Milos?
Let's check that.
All right, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right,
Yeah.
my apologies, and good morning, everyone. And Commissioner Fishman, I wanted to maybe come back to your question just briefly. So in the day-ahead market, once an EDAM entity joins the market, those resources that are within the footprint that the entities rely upon, those are modeled in our market. We know their characteristics. We know how long it takes them to start. We know any limitations. All that has to be modeled in the market. So hopefully, as the market is committing these resources in the day-ahead time frame, we're taking into account all of those limitations. And if we know, for example, that it takes a resource, 10 hours to start, we're committing it far enough in advance so that by the time that we need it, that resource is started. So if conditions didn't change, if resources didn't go in outage, the market knows when to commit those resources based on the individual characteristics. If something changes between day ahead and real time and a resource is lost, it's gone on outage unexpectedly, then that's where some of the other measures that the market has available to itself. We've got additional supply across the footprint that can be effectively dispatched or committed to fill in the gap. Or that balancing authority area may have other reserves that they're keeping that they may need to call upon to supplant that resource that's been lost. But hopefully the market is aware of all that and the individual resource characteristics. And so we're making feasible commitments. When we're committing a resource in day ahead time frame, we know that its operational characteristics can support the dispatch and the call on that resource.
So a quick follow-up on that is there sort of a minimum amount of participation that's required for the benefits to kick in? A scale that's required?
You're asking like some number of entities or some amount of the load?
Number of entities or, amount of megawatts, whatever.
Well, I guess the answer has to be yes. There's got to be some nominal amount, but honestly, it's pretty low. Like I mentioned earlier, Commissioner, the ease of entry makes it relatively inexpensive for entities to join. The ISO's software and systems are very easily scaled up. And so the cost to do that is relatively low. But I think the good news is we've got enough entities that have shown really strong interest in doing this that we're pretty confident that we're already there.
Okay. And am I on solid ground assuming that the greater the participation, the greater the potential benefits?
Yes. Yeah. In a very, very real way, it goes down our theme of talking about transmission here, right? What we've seen in the energy imbalance market is the more transmission that is brought into the optimization, the greater the benefits because of the ability to access the lower cost energy and take advantage of that. Now, as you well know, that's only occurring now in the real time. And what I like to say, those benefits are accruing just based on the little small pluses and minuses we can do based on the fleet that's already online and already operating in each of the balancing areas. Now we get an opportunity to actually start to decide which generators are going to be online. Hopefully we have access to more transmission because it's now in the day ahead time frame and start to see those benefits really rise significantly.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Commissioner Fishman, that's exactly the pattern that we've seen in the energy imbalance market. We started with Pacificor and the ISO only, and now it's grown to, I think, close to 80% of the West. But as those entities have increased and as more entities have joined the EIM, the benefits of balloon because of what Phil said. You have now a larger footprint that's sharing those resources. Transmission is made available in that real-time time frame, and we expect the same for the EDAM. The more entities that join, the greater the benefits across the footprint.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna ask some dumb questions just to be sure I could confirm that I'm tracking with you as you go along.
Sure.
So thank you.
So I have a follow-up question too. So do you anticipate that there will be more investment? I mean, I think there's a general strong interest in the West anyhow in investing in more transmission, but based on what I just heard, it sounds like you would reach a limit in terms of available transmission at some point in the EDAM. And are you relying on what seems like almost an inevitability that states are going to be investing in their own transmission anyhow, or the utilities in the states will, that is to say, to see continuing value realized by the day-ahead market?
Yeah. Milos, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. And I think Phil kind of highlighted this. The day-ahead market is not necessarily yet a step toward the RTO. So each individual transmission provider continues to, and that balancing authority area continues to retain their open access transmission tariff and their transmission planning function. And so they have to still ensure that on a long-term basis, they have sufficient supply under contract and sufficient transmission to be able to effectively continue to serve their load reliably. So we continue to expect that there are going to be investments in transmission under the day-ahead market design. However, as Phil noted earlier, some of the information from the EIM and the EDAM is hopefully going to, and the EIM as well, is hopefully going to try to maximize the use of the existing facilities that are in place. And there are going to be signals that I think come out of the market based on congestion, based on uses of transmission, that are going to indicate still over time at least potential information that can inform transmission planning. But that transmission planning function at this stage in the day-ahead market continues to remain with the individual transmission provider and balancing authority area. And the market outcomes can help inform where that investment is needed potentially on a longer term basis.
That's a real good description of what you see going forward. I just wondered if part of the thought process here is, expecting states to step up or the utilities to step up and find ways to fund filling in the holes in the transmission systems when it might not otherwise be in their interest, but for their purposes of trading in the day-ahead market, they'd somehow become, they'd see their self-interest differently.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I expect that one of the considerations maybe for entities, as they join the market and they see the benefits that they're deriving, to the extent that they can maximize and increase the transmission that's potentially made available to the EDAM, whether that's finding additional ways of making that transmission available or whether that's through upgrades, that can provide additional benefits. So, for example, an entity that makes a certain amount of transmission available between Pacificor and Nevada's system, but if you increase that transfer capability through upgrades or otherwise for a number of different drivers, the more transmission that you make available there, the more the benefits potentially you can derive, because then you're allowing for the transfer of more economic supply across the footprint or between those two balancing authority areas to derive those benefits. So that's one of the factors likely that on a long-term basis entities could consider in potentially driving the expansion, along with other needs that they may have on their own grid as they're doing their long-term resource planning. If they're entering into 10-year resource contracts, 5-year resource contracts, they're probably going to want some certainty on a long-term basis that they can deliver that on a long-term basis. And so that also is probably the primary driver of the upgrade. But then secondarily, you're looking to see, is that going to increase, again, the transmission that's made available between those balancing authority areas that can further then help in those day-ahead and real-time timeframes more economically serve my load and derive those economic benefits of the market.
Yeah.
I assume this is something that's talked about in one of your workshops that's been going on, correct? The development of the transmission system, kind of ad hoc.
Yeah, it's been touched on to a slightly lesser extent, but yeah, it's been part of the discussion. To what extent does the EDAM and participation in the market either ameliorate the need for certain projects, and to what extent would the addition of projects then allow for the derivation of additional benefits? Because the market, like Phil said, I think earlier, what the market does is really it tries to maximize the existing transmission rights in the transmission system that you have, and that potentially may decrease the need for certain projects as you gather some of this data on the system and where congestion is occurring, et cetera. But then on a long-term basis, there are other drivers that may be supporting the need for transmission upgrades, especially if you're looking to invest into generation in another balancing authority area and you're looking to have the certainty that you can deliver it on a long-term basis. That's a separate factor that drives an upgrade. So there's a bit of a push and pull here, different factors that need to be considered. But I think the theme that we've been discussing in our workshops is, look, the markets are going to allow you to maximize the use of that existing grid, and that can then help inform your own future transmission planning, depending upon how that grid is utilized by the market.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's very helpful. I really appreciate it, Milos.
Milos and Phil, one last transmission question. I hope this is the last one, and then you can get on to greenhouse gas. But how does, have you seen any trends? Because I have no idea what might happen with this. Have you seen any trends as storage comes on board and how that's impacting this whole transmission equation and how it's planned?
Well, I'm going to jump in here, Commissioner Fishman, because your question, I think I'm going to take it up a little level and just sort of generalize it a little more, if you will.
Okay.
Because I appreciated what the chairwoman was engaging with Milos there about, how does it affect transmission that's existing or potentially drive the support or not for new transmission, right? And where I was going to go is I think there's a third a leg to the stool here, right? There's a third pillar in there somewhere. And that is, I think where your question is, what is going to be the effects on transmission as a result of the resources changing, the evolution of the resources on the grid? I think we all know that the batteries themselves are not necessarily creating the energy like a power plant does, but they're certainly going to be able to shift the energy around to different times or seasons, if you will, if we get into long duration storage. But my point, of course, is that as we see certain resources exiting the market and all the newer, cleaner resources entering the market, that gives you a third piece of the puzzle here, and certainly the transmission, which is, do you need to repurpose transmission that you already have? Or do you need to potentially consider building new transmission to go access where the new resources and the fleet is evolving to? And I'll just share with you that we've seen all the above in California. California years ago had many hundreds of megawatts of coal-fired resources being imported from outside the state. Much of that transmission network now has been repurposed for other types of resources. Some of it's natural gas, but much of it is maybe wind and solar and other types of resources. But that transfer capability in and out of California has still been utilized as best as it can. But to your point now, back on the batteries and the storage stuff, of course, what storage does is potentially give you an opportunity again to use the transmission you have to transfer surplus energy from different parts of the grid to wherever the battery systems are, and then use the battery systems to help offset the load in other hours of the day. So guess what? Maybe you don't have to do that upgrade or build that new transmission line because the battery system is there 24 hours and transmission, is inadequate for the 24-hour period. So I hope that's helpful. And again, it takes us back to the theme that we've been talking about. What the markets can do is provide that information, the purveyor of data, to help understand what's happening on the grid And how often does that occur during the course of the year to be able to look at the financial and reliability benefits of making changes?
Thank you, Phil. Very helpful.
All right.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's touch a little bit more on the GHG. What we put in the straw proposal was identifying two different approaches. And this second one, the zonal approach, was actually provided by our stakeholders. And now we have the stakeholders actually producing a third option that's being discussed, which is really a hybrid, a combination of these two. But what I thought I'd do is take a few minutes with you and basically describe how these are working so you get a sense of why, when we started off talking about this, I was talking about the prices of carbon and how those get incorporated into the market. So let me do this real quick and then see what questions you have. The resource-specific approach is actually already being used in the EIM framework. The Western EIM uses this approach. And this is one reason why in the straw proposal we highlighted, as I say in the last bullet here, we're leaning towards the resource-specific approach for the EDAM. The way this works is any generators that are, let's say, outside of the GHG area, and today we could talk about just California has a GHG price. So any generators that are outside California that are potentially wanting to sell energy to California load can reflect that by giving us two prices. One price is their price for the energy, and the second price is their GHG adder, the price for the GHG cost that their resource would incur to sell that energy into the California market. To the extent the market finds that price desirable because the combination of those two, let's say, is less than the price of ramping up generation within California, then the EIM goes ahead and dispatches that external resource. And of course, we pay them not only for the energy, but we also give them the money for their GHG compliance that they need to pay into California's Air Resource Board. So they're revenue neutral from that standpoint. And it's the California load that ends up paying all that cost because it's California that has that carbon pricing regime that's in place today. Now, literally 2 or 3 years from now, we're expecting to see something like that in the state of Washington as well, something very, very similar. And so we're looking ahead, trying to design the EDAM so that it's flexible and scalable enough to have multiple carbon prices across this operational footprint. So that's, in a nutshell, what the resource-specific approach is, taking it into the day-ahead market and running something very similar to what I just described is happening today in the EIM. That has one big benefit, that the GHG profile that comes out of the day ahead is then very supportive on what goes on in the real time. And so the set of generators we expect to run will be very, very close to what ultimately happens in the real time operations. Now, the zonal was a completely different idea, recognizing that there are potentially a GHG zone where you have those costs and those other implications, and there are non-GHG zones. And the concept here then was to basically establish a hurdle rate from the non-GHG zone into the GHG zone. And to the extent the market could overcome that hurdle, then the non-GHG zone would transfer energy to the GHG one. Now, obviously, this is fairly scalable and could be operated in multiple different GHG and non-GHG zones across the West. But what we highlighted here, of course, is there's a few things that the state agencies would have to actually do in order to implement this. And in particular, the thing that we've heard back from at least California Air Resource Board is they really would like to know which resources were supporting this. And the zonal approach seeks not to be resource specific, but really just talk about what is the emissions that are being produced in the non-GHG zone as a portion of the energy that's being transferred to the GHG zone. So there's still some significant questions and concerns about the ability to implement this in the time frame, whether it would be acceptable to the state agencies that have these kinds of programs. And so the discussion is still going on. And that's why there's now under consideration something that might actually be a hybrid of these two, to see if there's some place that we can go forward into the EDAM design. Now, Not to say that even if we were, for example, to start with the resource-specific approach in the initial start of the market, that we still couldn't pivot at some point down the road if what we start seeing is a strong interest by multiple state agencies to do something that's more similar to the zonal approach. We could then look at how to modify the market, a few years from now and make a switch and move over to a completely different approach within the market clearing process. So I know I've talked a lot about GHG. It can obviously get really complicated real quickly, but did want to at least give you a sense that in the design is a recognition that where there's carbon pricing happening, then the market really should consider that price in making its dispatch and unit commitment decisions. So let me just stop there and say any questions I might be able to elaborate on in regards to GHG.
Yeah, I've got a question. I guess I'm hearing you say the beginning approach would be, well, I guess I'm hearing you say you haven't just decided whether or not to do the resource-specific approach or the zonal approach, right?
That's correct.
But if you were doing the zonal, what?
Yeah, I was going to say, you'll see us in the revised straw proposal that's coming out in a couple of weeks. You'll see us indicate resource-specific approach to start, but as Phil said, continuing to remain open towards evolving the framework towards other approaches.
Okay. Well, that's almost completely satisfies my question, which is, were you to pursue the resource-specific approach first? It seems like that's more graspable and by participants. Either they have trades can be made based on the types of resources, and I suppose in some areas nuclear would be welcome as a non-greenhouse gas emitting source, and in other places it wouldn't, for example, or carbon capture and storage processed fossil sources. If they were to succeed and were clean, then maybe they would be, if they were greenhouse gas free or low, then maybe they'd be welcome. But at least starting with the identification of the resource to begin with would be a lot more straightforward. So I guess my question is, seems like you'd run into problems in the future, for example, with a source, if it came to pass, that would be greenhouse gas free, even though it was derived from fossil fuels. And I suppose that's just part of the conversations and the workshops.
Well, it's that portion of the conversation is going to be more related to how the state policy or rules are going to assess, the carbon intensity of the resource. So as you say, Chairwoman, it is very possible that it could be a natural gas facility, but if it had a carbon capture mechanism that completely cleaned the emissions to, let's just say for discussion, zero output, then it's very possible that that state air resource board would determine then it's a clean resource. And the market then would equate it as zero emissions, similar to your other example of a nuclear facility. And so those two would be on par because it's been determined that neither of them are emitting, emissions into the atmosphere. So the market wouldn't do it. We're going to be depending upon what the respective state policies are in determining the carbon intensity from the various resources.
Okay, thanks.
All right, let's move to the next slide. Okay, so I'm just going to take a couple seconds and summarize where we've been, right? We've talked about the resource sufficiency, the EDAM entity bringing that supply to the market. I think I may have mentioned the idea being that there is a level of capacity to meet their load plus a uncertainty component. And what I mean by that is balancing areas, almost all balancing areas add a little bit in their day ahead processes. And we're seeing more and more of this as each balancing area is struggling to match, the variability of different renewable resources and the fleet as the fleet is modifying. And so the concept here is to look at an uncertainty level in addition to the load, show they've got the resources to do that. The market then is going to optimize and do the unit commitment and dispatch in that day ahead timeframe. The way the market then will utilize that level of uncertainty is frankly this imbalanced reserve product, because what that does is now has a small amount of capacity in each one of the balancing areas that can be called upon and utilized, transferred across the system to try to help out for what if there is an imbalance? What is there is some of that uncertainty that starts to actually come to reality in real operations. But now again, you can see the benefit of is instead of each balancing area having to do that on their own, we actually have a pool that's being contributed across the whole footprint. And then, so what these ultimately do is add up to a larger fleet of resources that has a much better chance of managing the risk when we run into some of these more stressed system conditions that we're starting to see now. Now, sometimes, the environmental conditions are going to create, low probability, but high impact events. And what we're looking at in designing the market is to help mitigate those and reduce that risk because of everybody working together in a much larger footprint. So I'm going to stop here in my portion. We're ready to move on to Holly and talking a little bit about stakeholder process as well as governance. But I'll just stop here and say anything left in regards to the market design, or we certainly can answer questions after Holly's done as well.
Thank you, Phil. Please,
Phil,
go ahead.
I may have missed this. This is Steve. How much reserve or excess are participants going to be asked to have? And I know there's so many ways to measure this, and it's getting more complicated with variable resources, but
So let me turn to Milos on that, because the uncertainty will be formulaic, looking at the level of uncertainty that's happening on each specific balancing area. So those that tend to be more stable and less variability are going to have a much smaller uncertainty amount. But those that have more variability and more uncertainty would then have a higher amount. And Milos, anything to sort of add to that in regards to how we're going to calculate that percentage on a BA basis?
Oh, that's right, Phil. You got that right. I think we're going to have a common requirement, effectively, I think to a 95% certainty threshold, so that everybody's kind of looking at the same measure. And as Phil noted, it may vary depending on the size of the balancing authority area. Maybe a few megawatts for one, and for California, maybe a more sizable amount because we're just bigger. But it will be based on a formulaic factor and an uncertainty factor to meet 95% of the uncertainty that may materialize, based on those differences and that may vary based upon how many renewables you have on your footprint and such. So
okay, thank you.
So thank you, Commissioner. The way I would sort of think about this, and you'll see we've talked a lot about comparing the EDAM with RTO kind of construct. And the one theme I would throw out here in answering this question as well, from a policy standpoint, you'll see us always want to try to design things kind of on a cost causation basis. And that's why I wanted Milos to describe this, right? It'll be a formula, but the formula is not going to be a static percentage, right? It'll be a variation in regards to the risk that balancing area has, and that may vary substantially from one BA to another, but at least it'll be a consistent formula applied to all BAs.
Makes sense.
All right. Okay, so Holly, back to you.
All right, thanks, Phil. Colin, if we could move forward 2 slides, I believe. And being conscious of time, I'm going to move through really quickly, but then I'd be happy to follow up at any time. So just milestones going forward, as we mentioned, the ISO continued to conduct stakeholder workshops throughout July to further refine and improve upon the initial straw proposal. And now on August 16th, we expect to publish a revised proposal. And on August 29th, we'll hold a stakeholder meeting that will be virtual to go through that straw proposal. And then looking at possibly putting together some stakeholder meetings in person in September to further discuss that. But going forward, there's still time to engage, still time to comment in the process. We hope to put a final proposal before the WEAM governing body and ISO Board of Governors at the end of this year for their approval. If approved there, then the proposal would go to FERC. We'd file with FERC and need approval there in early 2023. That would be followed by implementation activities of the EDAM and a go live date, hopefully in 2024. Commissioner Hall, as part of your BOSSR updates that you see from me occasionally, there are updates on what's coming and what to expect. So you can see what the current events are and current status is and where there are further opportunities to engage there. But again, if there are any questions, please let me know. So Colin, let's move to the next slide. In parallel to the development of the market design, the Governance Review Committee is also looking at what governance would look like under an EDAM model. And the Governance Review Committee, yeah, was there a question? No, okay. The Governance Review Committee, they're charged with working with stakeholders across the West on developing a governance proposal that will also be brought before the WEAM governing body and Board of Governors at the end of this year for consideration. Again, what does governance look like under an EDAM market design? So under the current model, the WEAM governing body, that's a governing body that is charged with representing the interests of stakeholders from across the West. They work in parallel and have joint authority with the Board of Governors to approve any rules that apply to the market balancing authority areas, entities, and also market participants. So there's shared authority there. And the body of state regulators, as you know, that's a body of state regulators that provides a state perspective on all of these proposals. Any rules, again, that apply to the balancing authority areas, entities, and market participants. I see. Okay, oh, thanks, Phil. I'm just looking at your note. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So some particular questions that the Governance Review Committee is looking at right now are what is the appropriate type of authority for the governing body? What is the appropriate scope of that authority? And what is the role for stakeholders in market design? What role should they play when a proposal is brought forward before it is delivered to the governing body and the Board of Governors for consideration? Also looking at some specifics with regard to the board and the WEAM governing body itself. So a straw, next slide, Colin. A straw proposal on governance was published on July 15th, and there will be, comments are due on August 15th, and that will be followed by a public meeting to discuss comments received on governance on August 29th. You'll see that's the same day as the EDAM market design straw proposal. The GRC public meeting will be in the morning, 8 to 10, followed by a EDAM stakeholder meeting to discuss the revised proposal on the market design. So a lot going on there. I'd be happy to follow up and answer any questions on that, and I'll continue, Chairwoman Hall, to provide the updates that you see to keep you apprised of developments along both lines of along both initiatives. So I believe that's our last slide. Yeah.
Thank you.
And you're welcome. I think we have 1.5 minutes to answer any other questions, but I think we're available to stay over if the chairwoman and the commissioners are available to stay over.
Yeah, we definitely have time for whatever questions there are. We're not trying to boot you out the door at all. This is really quite interesting. In fact, I thought I saw Steve, and he's trying to talk, but he's muted.
Not muted.
There we
we're
go.
trying to take as long as we can so you can't get to the rest of your work. But actually, I did have a question. We had our Uri, the storm Uri, and we had prices for power go up 200-fold in our footprint in various areas, and particularly in Texas. And pretty outrageous, in my opinion, the way that whole thing panned out. And what impact would you see being part of EDAM having on events like that, and what happens with market prices? Would it have any impact at all on those kinds of emergency situations, and what might it be?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll take the pricing piece, because maybe that's easier. And now I'll let Milos talk about the the resource piece, because it has been a discussion we've been having, and we get into deficiencies, how to handle that. But let me start off with your pricing aspect of the question, Commissioner. Is that again, prices get derived in our wholesale markets really from sort of two aspects to consider. One is the underlying fuel. And so in the situation where, we're all experiencing it here in the Southwest, where if we have a cold snap, particularly in the middle of the country, they're going to be willing to pay more money for natural gas. And we also may have difficulty in just transporting the natural gas, all the way from you in New Mexico to Arizona to California. And so we are on the end of the pipeline from where you're at, right? So it is true that depending on what the cost of the fuel is, we can naturally see prices rise just because of fuel cost, right? Now, the other aspect of this, of course, is what happens if, you can move to a different set of resources. Let's say, while natural gas prices are rising, if we have a larger footprint that could actually utilize energy, let's say from the Pacific Northwest, where they are now in the same scenario have a surplus of hydro, or we're going to see more wind and resources in the Pacific Northwest. Those resources are clearly going to be less expensive. Now the question is, are they available at the same time that we need them to compensate for the natural gas, right? So I think you see where I'm headed with this is, if we assume that we've got enough natural gas and enough resources, then the wholesale market will look for opportunities where to find the lower cost resources and operate those. The higher cost resources are still there for a reliability standpoint if needed to be, but we wouldn't necessarily have to operate them because there may be lower cost energy available in the larger footprint. And that's the economic side of it. But now we move down that scale a little bit till suddenly, all of a sudden, we start finding that maybe there's not enough fuel to operate some of those generators, or there are major transmission line outages where suddenly we're now moving into a world of resource deficiency. And there's been a lot of discussion with the stakeholders on that topic. And that's why I thought we might see what kind of thoughts Milos has on, how do we deal with things when we move into areas where supply is tight or maybe even deficient. And so Milos, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. And great question. So as Phil noted, if you remember that slide on confidence and transfers a little bit ago, and what we talked about resource sufficiency, each balancing authority area is bringing to the table sufficient supply to meet their own obligations, expected load obligations, plus a level of uncertainty that we talked about. And as well as any excess supply, there are incentives in the market that if you have more than that, you can imagine it's a 20,000, their peak load is 50,000 megawatts, but it's a typical day in the Northwest and the load is only 30,000 megawatts as an extreme example. They have excess supply that they can make available and offer to the market. They met their obligation, but they now have an incentive to make more available because you can more economically serve your load, and those resources could be dispatched to meet other obligations, that excess supply. Now look at that across the wider footprint. Everybody's coming to the table with enough supply to meet their own needs and likely some excess across the footprint. As Phil mentioned before, there's a diversity across that wider western footprint. The load may not be peaking at the same time or in the same season in the Northwest as it does in Arizona. They're winter peaking versus summer peaking, or there's a diversity in that as well. And so when you get into these tight system conditions where one balancing authority area or a couple balancing authority areas in a particular region of the West are facing challenging conditions, generation is going on outage, the loads are peaking, they don't have enough supply. That's where you can really leverage the supply across the wider footprint to deliver it and to meet those load needs in that particularly affected area and those stress system conditions. So that's one key element of this design, is that resource diversity, that diversity of the region really can help us ameliorate or decrease the risk of those emergency conditions, because if you don't have supply in one area because it's a tight condition, the supply across the rest of the footprint can be dispatched by the market to backfill. Whereas I think, not to go too much into the Texas case, but as you know, they're kind of a bubble. And so there's limited supply that you can depend upon from other states. But here across the wider footprint, you have that diversity of supply that can be dispatched and committed also in the day-ahead time frame or dispatched in real time to fill in the gaps if something has changed. And then as well, Phil touched on it as well, there's a number of different products that the market procures, like the imbalance reserve product. That's capacity as well that the market procures, that's standing ready to address differences in conditions across the footprint that may materialize. And so that's additional supply that you can tap into when those conditions change in a particular balancing authority area. And then I think finally, what I want to note is, if you get into that extreme situation where the market doesn't have enough, there's not enough supply in the footprint, the market will have done everything it can. Every last megawatt will have been dispatched to meet the needs of that footprint. But ultimately, at that point, you fall back on the individual balancing authority areas having their reliability function. And each balancing authority area may have different tools that haven't been used yet to ameliorate those conditions. So you may have certain demand response that's not in the market. You may have certain backup or standby generation that you can call upon after the market has done everything it can to resolve the issue. There's potentially emergency assistance agreements that you may have. There may be reserve sharing pools. All this to say is that if you get into that tight system condition, the market will look to resolve it. And in a vast majority of cases, there should be enough supply across the footprint to address the issue. But if not, then each balancing authority area, it doesn't immediately fall to load shed or certain conditions. Each balancing authority has tools at its disposal, supply that may be being held back from the market for those emergency conditions, and that can be relied upon to serve load. And the other balancing authority areas that you're depending upon for supply, those transfers that have been committed, they're going to be honoring those transfers to ensure that, to mitigate and minimize the risk of you going into an emergency condition. So we think overall, a number of these features are going to, compared to today, are going to put balancing authority areas in a better place and decrease the instance and the risk of emergency conditions, because you now are part of that larger footprint, part of that larger pool of resources and other effectively supply that's been secured that can be made available to resolve any one balancing authority area issue that if they were on their own, they may have a bit of a tougher time trying to resolve. But now you're part of that bigger pool that can help and share that supply to address the issue.
So the short answer is you see the basic market dynamics of having a larger footprint and those benefits holding up even in an emergency situation.
That's right. And it's because of those requirements. Everybody's coming in. It's not just you can bring in whatever you want to the market. No, you have to come in with enough things to meet, enough supply to meet your needs. Excess supply is offered in the market. So we feel confident there's going to be supply across the footprint that's going to be able to respond to changes in conditions. There are those extreme cases now if the entire Western interconnection is, it doesn't have enough supply. That's a fairly out there scenario, but those are the conditions where at that point, then it turns over to the balance. The market will do everything it can. It will dispatch the last megawatt, and hopefully it will have mitigated the risk. But then each balancing authority area has their own tools that they can also tap into to mitigate that becoming and proliferating and becoming a wider issue. And we think that that's going to really decrease the need or decrease the instance of emergency conditions. The larger that pool is, the larger that footprint, I think the lower the risk for any one balancing authority area that there will be an emergency condition.
Thank you, Milos.
So I'd like to just ask a small follow-up question. I think I heard you say a couple of times, Milos, you had to, or an entity that wants to participate in the market, they have to come in with their equivalent amount of resources, but they also have to have a reserve, I believe, correct? Some sort of additional reserve that passes the test of the market.
That's right. That's right. And I think, yeah, the resource sufficiency evaluation looks at, do you have enough supply to meet your load for the next day, plus the level of uncertainty that we talked about. In addition to that, you know, consistent with NERC standards, and this is what every balancing authority area does today, is under NERC standards, they also have to have certain reserves that they've secured. You know, if they lose a sizable amount of generation, you have to have certain contingency reserves. And so each balancing authority area will still have that obligation and ensure that they have sufficient reserves. So that's why, you know, we feel confident that if each balancing authority area is doing their long-term resource planning and is ensuring that, just as they do today, they're planning today for the next day. You know, they're trying to make sure that today they have enough supply for tomorrow. The EDAM makes that a more formal test and says, do you have enough supply? And provides incentives for you to come with enough supply, so that once we do get into those conditions that Mr. Fishman noted, then everybody benefits from ensuring that there's a robust supply in the footprint that can respond to any one balancing authority area deficiency or need or changes in conditions that may materialize between day ahead and real time, and decrease the risk of emergency conditions.
Okay, thanks. So, Holly, is there more?
No, we are finished if there are no other questions. We sincerely appreciate your time. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to provide the briefing. There's more to come, and happy to answer any questions that come up in the future. So thank you.
Well, I see Commissioner Maes is popping up. Did you have any questions, Vice Chair?
No, I just wanted to express my thanks for the presentation. I think this is very encouraging, you know, not just for New Mexico, but for the West. So, so thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
I'm pretty excited by the prospect of this getting off the ground and being a first baby step for the West to get where we need to be.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Holly. I want to echo these comments. This is a tremendous effort. I know you guys have been working on for years, and I really appreciate it as an opportunity for our utilities in our state, or the ones that are relevant to. We have two utilities who are in the Western Energy Imbalance Market, and I look forward to hearing how these details work out for greenhouse gas emissions. So, and thank you very much, Phil and Milos as well. Your contributions were just so illuminating, and we don't get this sort of presentation very often. We're busy with our own daily caseload, and this is quite a good window into how EDAM is going to be working. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
I know.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. And I'd like to see the agenda back up, but I don't think there's anything else really to do except adjourn. But can we show that again, Hans, just to double check? Okay. All right. And I take it nobody else in the listening audience here has any more questions, correct? Okay, hearing none.